"We never wanted you here," Caroline screamed, and the turkey hadn't even been carved. My hand froze mid-toast, the crystal glass shaking. Dean smirked, topped off his scotch, and added, "Tell him the rest." That's when they dropped the real gift. They were selling my house, the one Margaret and I built over 38 years, the deed already in their name. "We've already found you a nice assisted living place," she said, like I was a broken appliance. But they forgot one thing. I may be old, but I never throw away paper, especially not the kind that bites back, and they just triggered the clause. Now I've got 7 days to make them regret ever thinking I was disposable. My name is Walter Whitaker, and I'm 75 years old. After 42 years running Whitaker Hardware, I spend my days in a small apartment that still carries the scent of Margaret's favorite lemon furniture polish. My daughter Caroline and her husband Dean pressed me to sign over the house deed last spring. "Just smart tax planning," they said. Each morning I sit in Margaret's oak rocking chair, reviewing the carefully labeled records I've kept since 1975. The Christmas dinner invitation from Caroline arrived yesterday, typed rather than handwritten, with a note about discussing arrangements. My fingers traced the old receipt for the house transfer, filed in a manila folder marked Family Trust Documents. But let me start from the beginning. I pulled into Caroline's driveway right at 4, same as every Christmas since Margaret passed. The wrapped presents sat neat and patient on the passenger seat, a leather-bound journal for Caroline, wood-carved toy soldiers for the boys, and that special tin of hard candies Margaret always insisted made the holidays complete. Between the gifts lay her recipe, card for cranberry relish, the edges worn soft from decades of Christmas dinners. You know the kind. Yellowed index card, blue ink faded just enough to make you squint. The porch lights were already on, though the sun hadn't set. Caroline's house stood there decked in those LED icicle lights Dean favors, nothing like the warm-colored bulbs Margaret and I used to string up. I checked my reflection in the car window, straightened my wool sweater, and gathered the presents in my arms. Tommy, my eldest grandson, opened the door before I could knock. "Grandpa's here," he called over his shoulder, but there wasn't the usual rush of feet or happy chaos. Just Dean standing by the fireplace, nursing what I figured wasn't his first scotch, wearing that knowing smirk I'd grown to distrust. Caroline emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile seemed stretched too thin, like a rubber band about to snap. "Merry Christmas," I said, holding out the gifts. The boys took them with quick glances at their mother, as if checking whether excitement was allowed. "I brought Margaret's cranberry relish recipe too. Thought we might want it for—" "You can set those on the side table," Caroline cut in, already turning back to the kitchen. I watched her go, that familiar ache pressing against my ribs. Remember when she used to climb into my lap with picture books, begging for one more story, Daddy? The living room felt like a stage set, everything arranged just so. Christmas carols drifted from hidden speakers, but they seemed to bounce off the walls rather than fill the space. Dean kept his post by the hearth, that smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. The boys sat stiffly on the couch, phones in hand, thumbs tapping out messages to somewhere else. When Caroline called us to dinner, I took my usual spot, the one where Margaret used to sit to my right. Steam rose from the turkey, perfect as a magazine cover, but something was missing. No serving bowls passed hand to hand, no stories flowing between bites. Just the scratch of forks against plates, and those tinny carols fighting the silence. I cleared my throat, raising my water glass. The crystal caught the light. A wedding gift to Margaret, and be now part of Caroline's collection. "I'd like to propose a toast," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "To family, to another year together, and to the memories that bind us." The slam of Caroline's glass hitting the table cut through everything. Water sloshed across the white tablecloth, spreading like a stain we'd all been pretending wasn't there. She pushed back her chair and stood, her face flushed with more than just wine. "We never wanted you here." The words cracked across the table like a whip. My hand froze mid-toast, water trembling in the crystal. Forks clattered against plates. The boys stared at their laps, while Dean nodded, satisfaction written across his face, plain as newspaper headlines. "Every Christmas," Caroline went on, her voice rising over silent night floating from the speakers, "we have to watch you shuffle in with your sad little presents and your stories. Nobody wants to hear. We've moved on, Dad. Why can't you?" The room tilted sideways. I lowered my glass, the crystal suddenly too heavy to hold. Through the window, I could see my car in the driveway, waiting like a faithful dog. The cranberry recipe card sat forgotten on the side table, Margaret's handwriting fading into irrelevance. Dean topped off his scotch, ice cubes clinking like tiny bells. "Tell him the rest, Caroline. No point dragging it out." I felt the winter chill seeping through the walls, or maybe it was coming from inside me. 40 years of hardware store receipts, mortgage payments, Christmas dinners, all of it scattered like the water spots on that white tablecloth. My mouth opened, but the words stuck somewhere between memory and pride. Should I remind Caroline of the summer afternoons teaching her to ride her bike? The Saturday mornings at the store, letting her arrange the nail bins by size? Or would that just prove her point about living in the past? Caroline's words hung in the air like smoke, but something in Dean's smile told me worse was coming. You know that feeling when you're about to step off a curb and spot ice too late? That's how my stomach felt right then. "Since we're being honest," Dean said, swirling his scotch, "might as well tell you the whole thing. We're selling the house." My throat went dry. "My house?" "Our house," Caroline corrected, emphasis sharp as a nail. "The deed's been in our names for what, 3 years now? Your idea, remember? Something about tax advantages." The memory hit like a hammer blow. I'd signed those papers in my accountant's office, thinking I was being clever, protecting the family legacy. Margaret had just passed, and I wasn't thinking straight. Caroline had suggested it so casually over Sunday dinner, just a simple transfer to save on estate taxes when the time came. "But that's my home," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I meant it to. 38 years. Margaret's rose garden is there. My workshop. Dean cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Market's hot right now. Buyers want older homes they can gut and flip, already got an offer." My fingers found the edge of the table, gripping tight. Those roses. Margaret had planted them the spring after we moved in. Every June they bloomed like clockwork, pink and yellow faces turning to catch the morning sun. And my workshop, where I'd taught the boys to build birdhouses when they were small, before phones and video games claimed them. "When?" The word scratched coming out. Dean grabbed a paper napkin, fishing a pen from his pocket. He scrawled something and slid it across the table. I picked it up, the white square, trembling in my hand. "Closing, New Year's," I read aloud. The date sat there like a death sentence, decorated with Dean's aggressive check mark. "Perfect timing," Caroline said, her voice brittle as thin ice. "New year, new start. We've already found you a nice assisted living place, very modern, they have activities." I looked up at the Christmas tree, its lights blurring through something that definitely wasn't tears. Margaret and I had collected those ornaments over decades. The little wooden train from our first Christmas, the angel the church ladies gave us when Carolyn was born. Now they'd probably end up in some dumpster along with my workbench and Margaret's garden trowel. The room started closing in. Dean's smirk, Caroline's cold eyes, the boys still focused on their phones. It all spun together like sawdust in a storm. 7 days. They'd waited until Christmas to tell me, leaving 7 days to what? Fight back? Give in? Pack up 38 years of memories? I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood. I should go. "Dad!" Caroline started, but there was no softness in it, just impatience, like I was a customer holding up the checkout line. "The bus," I mumbled, grabbing my coat. "Don't want to miss the bus." Nobody moved to stop me. Nobody offered a ride, though the temperature had dropped well below freezing. I fumbled with my buttons, heading for the door. The last thing I heard was Dean's voice, casual as discussing the weather. Well, that went better than expected. Outside, the cold hit like a slap. I pulled my collar tight, watching my breath cloud in the porch light. Through their front window, I could see the party shifting back to normal. Caroline gathering plates, Dean pouring another scotch, the boys still glued to their screens. The scene looked like one of those Christmas cards where everything's perfect, except I was on the wrong side of the glass. I pulled out my phone, its glow harsh in the darkness. December 25th stared back at me. 7 days. The numbers burned into my brain as I started walking, snow crunching under my boots. 7 days to save my home, my dignity, whatever scraps of family I had left. The bus stop bench loomed ahead, dusted with fresh snow. 7 days till New Year's, 7 days before they erased me from my own life. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was wading through all those years I'd thought meant something. You know that moment when you wake up hoping yesterday was just a bad dream? That was me the morning after Christmas. The house felt different somehow, like every familiar corner was already saying goodbye. Funny how spaces can turn strange on you. Overnight, isn't it? I shuffled into the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The teacup I'd set out before heading to Caroline's sat exactly where I'd left it, empty and waiting. Margaret's old rooster clock ticked away on the wall, marking time like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Caroline's words kept echoing. "We never wanted you here." The spite in her voice. That wasn't my little girl. That was someone else, entirely. Someone who'd been planning this ambush for God knows how long. My hands shook as I picked up the phone. Had to try, didn't I? The call went straight to voicemail. "Caroline, honey, we need to talk about this. Please." My voice cracked a bit, but I kept going. "Your mother's garden, my workshop, there has to be another way." I waited 15 minutes, then tried again. This time, Dean answered. "Walter." His voice had that oily smoothness I'd always distrusted. "Caroline's pretty upset right now. We all need some space to move forward with this transition." "Forward?" The word tasted bitter. "You mean throwing me out of my own home?" "Your former home," he corrected. "Look, change is hard at your age. We get it. But this is happening. Best accept it." The line went dead before I could respond. You ever notice how silence can feel like a physical weight? It pressed down on me as I wandered through the house, touching things like I was saying goodbye. The doorframe where we'd marked Caroline's height growing up, the handles of my old tools hanging in perfect rows, that sunny corner by the window where Margaret used to read her mystery novels. I could almost see her there sometimes, spectacles perched on her nose, afternoon light making a halo of her silver hair. She would have known what to do about all this. Margaret always saw the angles I missed. The mailbox flag was up when I checked, probably Christmas cards I couldn't bring myself to open. Instead, I found a glossy flyer. "Fast closings, cash for homes." The smiling faces on it made my stomach turn. How long had they been planning this? While I was bringing presents and sharing Sunday dinners, were they already measuring the walls for sale? Ever try forcing down food when your gut's tied in? Schnotz! I managed 2 bites of toast before pushing the plate away. The calendar on the wall seemed to mock me, each remaining square of December like a countdown to extinction. 7 days. 6 now, really. How do you pack up nearly 4 decades in less than a week? My phone buzzed. A text from Caroline. "It's for the best." For the best? 3 words to justify erasing everything Margaret and I had built. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but what could I say? Instead, I hit delete and set the phone face down. Didn't need to see any more messages explaining why my life needed demolishing. I pulled out the phone book. Yes, I still keep one. Modern problems sometimes need old-school solutions. There was a lawyer downtown who'd helped with Margaret's will. Maybe he could... But then what? What if he just confirmed what I feared, that I'd signed away everything trying to be clever? With taxes. The receiver felt heavy in my hand as I stared at the number. One call could tell me if I had any hope at all, or it could confirm I was as helpless as they thought, a foolish old man who'd given away his anchor to the world. I set the phone down without dialing. Tomorrow, I told myself. I'd call tomorrow when my head was clearer. But we both know what I was really doing, putting off the moment when someone in a suit would tell me I had no cards left to play. The workshop light clicked on with that familiar buzz. You know the sound, like an old friend clearing their throat. December darkness came early, pressing against the basement windows, but down here everything still smelled like sawdust and possibility. Or at least it used to. I ran my hand along the pegboard where my tools hung, each outline carefully traced in black marker. Margaret used to tease me about that. "In case they try sneaking away in the night," she'd say, that little smile playing at the corners of her mouth. What would she say now, watching me stand here like a ghost in my own space? The furnace ticked in the corner, marking time. Tick, tick, tick. Each sound like another grain of sand dropping through the hourglass. I could almost hear Margaret's voice. "Steady on, Walter. You've weathered worse storms." Had I, though? Even after she passed, I'd had the house, the workshop, my routines. The thought of losing it all made my chest tight. You know what's funny? Well, not funny, ha-ha, but funny strange, how your whole life can fit into file folders. I pulled open the drawer where I kept everything. Warranties, invoices, instruction manuals dating back to the Carter administration. Each piece of paper represented something I'd built, fixed, or maintained. 38 years of careful records, because that's what responsible men do, right? The folder tabs fanned out like piano keys. Appliances, electrical, plumbing, taxes. My fingers brushed across them, but I couldn't make myself pull any out. What good were all these records now? They were just paper. Yellow-edged, stapled hole-punch proof that I'd once thought keeping track of things mattered. Maybe Caroline's right, I said to the empty room. The words hung in the air like cobwebs. Maybe I am taking up too much space. Ever notice how silence can feel like agreement? The furnace just kept ticking, indifferent to my surrender. Even the tools on the wall seemed to look away, ashamed of their master's weakness. My knees weren't what they used to be as I pushed myself up from the workbench. The light switch clicked off with a finality that made my throat tight. One hand on the banister, I climbed the stairs, slower than usual. Each step felt like adding another year to my age. Upstairs, the house was already settling into evening shadows. I'd packed a bag earlier, just the essentials, mind you. Toothbrush, medications, 2 changes of clothes. Just in case, I told myself, setting it by the front door. But we both know what it really meant. It meant I was practicing for the end. The bottom step of the main staircase had always been my thinking spot. Margaret used to find me there when decisions weighed heavy. She'd sit next to me, not saying anything, just being there until the path forward got clearer. Now I sat alone, watching darkness fill the corners of our home like rising water. Did you ever notice how a house feels different in the dark? All the familiar shapes turned strange. The clock on the mantel became just another shadow. The family photos on the wall faded to black rectangles. Even Margaret's rocking chair looked like it belonged to someone else. I set my phone alarm for 6, early enough to catch the first bus downtown if I decided to see that lawyer. But who was I kidding? The fight had drained out of me like air from an old tire. Maybe it's easier this way, I whispered to the darkness. The words tasted like defeat, but they were all I had left. Maybe it's better than spending another winter fighting against the tide. The house creaked and settled around me, old timber adjusting to the cold. Or maybe it was just sighing in disappointment. I stayed there on that bottom step, watching the last traces of daylight fade from the windows, until the house went completely dark, until I couldn't tell the difference between the shadows and myself. The morning sun hit the frost on my bedroom window like diamonds on fire. I'd barely slept, just dozed in fits and starts, my mind chewing over the same bitter thoughts. You know how night problems always seem bigger in the dark? Well, these hadn't shrunk any in the daylight. I was still lying there, trying to convince myself to face another day, when the knock came. Not one of those polite neighbor checking-in taps, but 3 solid hits that rattled the hallway frames. Margaret's graduation photo actually tilted sideways. She would have hated that. The peephole showed a familiar, broad-shouldered silhouette. Frank Morrison, my old business partner from the hardware store days. We'd weathered 2 recessions and a flood together before I sold him my share 5 years back. Some handshakes mean more than contracts, and Frank's grip was still ironclad when I opened the door. "Walter," he said, stomping snow off his boots. "Thought I'd catch you before you headed out." His face was more lined than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp as ever under that grey brush cut. "Come on in," I said, leading him to the kitchen. "Coffee's about all I can offer right now." You ever notice how some friends can read a room like a newspaper? Frank's gaze swept over everything while I poured the coffee, the half-packed bag by the stairs, the untouched mail pile, the empty cookie tin that usually stayed full through New Year's. His expression didn't change, but his lips pressed together just a fraction. The steam curled up between our mugs like question marks while we settled at the kitchen table. Margaret's old rooster clock tick-tocked on the wall, counting out seconds neither of us was filling with words. "Was checking in with Paulson's Supply over on McKinley," Frank finally said, wrapping his hands around the mug. "Figured since I was in the neighborhood, I'd get eyes on you." He paused. "Glad I did." I stared down at my coffee, watching my reflection ripple in the black surface. Shame's a funny thing. It can make even your oldest friends feel like strangers. That obvious, huh? Let's just say you're not sitting like a man who had a Merry Christmas. Frank took a slow sip. Want to tell me about it? The words came out clipped and stiff, like I was reading someone else's bad news. The Christmas dinner. Caroline's outburst. The house sale. Each piece of it sounded more pathetic out loud than it had in my head. Jesus, Walter. Frank set his mug down hard enough to slosh coffee onto the tablecloth. Margaret would have had words about that too. And you're just sitting here taking it? What else can I do? My voice sounded older than I felt. The deed's in her name. Legal and proper. Frank leaned back, crossing his arms. Remember that supplier back in '92? The one who tried, shorting us on that big lumber order. Thompson Brothers, I said automatically. Some headaches you don't forget. And what did we do? Pulled every invoice, checked every... I trailed off as his meaning hit home. Then we treat this like any bad invoice, Frank said, that old problem-solving glint in his eye. First, find the paper. The kitchen seemed a little brighter suddenly, like someone had wiped grime off a window. Frank was right. We'd built our business on attention to detail, on triple-checking every document before signing. Why should this be any different? I've got records going back to the Carter administration, I said, feeling the first spark of something that wasn't despair. Every agreement, every modification. That's the Walter Whitaker I know, Frank nodded, pushing back from the table. Now, where do we start? Looking at him there, sleeve cuffs already, rolled up like we were about to inventory shelf stock, I felt the fog of the past few days starting to lift. Maybe I wasn't as alone in this fight as I'd thought. There's something else you need to know, Frank said, setting his mug down carefully. Part of why I'm here, actually. I recognized that tone. It was the same one he'd used when he had to tell me our biggest account was filing bankruptcy back in '98. Go on. I was at O'Malley's last night having my usual Thursday beer. Your son-in-law came in with some realtor type, all suit and teeth, you know the kind. Frank's jaw tightened. They were celebrating. The coffee in my stomach turned to acid. Celebrating what? The house sale, for one. But it wasn't just that. Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping. Your son-in-law, he was running his mouth, bragging about how they were finally draining the old man for good. You know that moment when shame burns so hot it turns into something else entirely? That's what happened in my chest right then. All those years of keeping books straight, counting pennies, making sure every customer got exactly what they paid for. And here was my own son-in-law laughing about bleeding me dry. There's more, Frank continued, watching my face. They raised their glasses. To New Year's, they said. Like it was some kind of countdown to victory. I pushed back from the table so hard my chair scraped against the linoleum. Margaret had always hated that sound, but right then I couldn't hear anything over the rushing in my ears. Without a word, I headed for the basement door. Walter, Frank called after me. Help me with something, I said, already heading down the stairs. The metal file cart had been gathering dust in the corner, but its wheels still turned smooth when I grabbed the handle. 30 years of paperwork organized just the way Margaret had taught me. By year, by type, everything in its place. The cart made a satisfying thunk when I pushed it up against the kitchen table. One by one, I laid out manila folders in neat rows, creating a timeline in buff-colored cardboard. Some tabs were faded, others crisp, but everyone had my handwriting, clear as the day I'd labeled them. You take 2010 through 2015, I told Frank, sliding him a stack. I'll start with these warranty binders. There might be something about property terms in the fine print. I pulled a yellow legal pad between us, uncapped my pen, and wrote at the top, Find deed, transfer terms, residence rights. The question got 2 firm circles around it. Some things need underlining, others need circles. Another lesson from Margaret. She'd been a high school English teacher and red pen habits die hard. We need to know exactly what that transfer agreement said, I muttered, more to myself than Frank. Every clause, every condition. There's got to be something about continued residence rights. Has to be. Frank was already paging through the first folder, his reading glasses perched on his nose. What's our timeline look like? I met his eyes across the paper spread. Answers by nightfall, I said firmly. Next steps planned by morning. New Year's isn't that far off. Just like old times, Frank nodded, reaching for another folder. Remember how we used to do inventory counts? You on one aisle, me on the other. Meeting in the middle with our tallies, I finished, feeling the ghost of a smile for the first time in days. Only this time, We're counting words instead of washers. The kitchen settled into the quiet rhythm of turning pages and scratching pens. Outside, the winter sun crept higher, throwing squares of light across our impromptu war room. Every so often, one of us would grunt or mutter, marking another note on the legal pad. I paused on a page from 2012, my eyes catching on Margaret's signature at the bottom. She'd insisted on co-signing everything important, right up until the end. "We're going to fix this," I whispered to her memory. "Just watch." Frank glanced up. "What's that?" "Nothing," I said, turning back to the warranties. "Just talking to an old proofreader." The yellow pad between us was starting to fill with notes, questions, and possibilities. Each new entry felt like another brick in a wall between me and that smirking son-in-law raising his glass to my ruin. Let him drink to New Year's. We had work to do. Hours slipped by like water through fingers as Frank and I worked our way through those files. You ever notice how paper has its own kind of music? The whisper of turning pages, the crackle of old folders, the soft thump of rubber stamps hitting the table. It was like some quiet symphony of determination. "Got anything?" I'd ask every so often, and Frank would just shake his head, push his reading glasses higher on his nose, and keep going. The kitchen grew dim around us. I got up once to flip on the overhead light, catching a whiff of coffee gone cold in our forgotten mugs. Reminded me of those late nights doing inventory at the hardware store, when Margaret would bring us fresh thermoses and tell us not to work too hard. Always said it with that little smile of hers, knowing full well we'd be there till midnight anyway. "Walter!" Frank called out suddenly, his voice different. "Come look at this stack." I pushed aside a pile of tax letters and moved around the table. He had a batch of papers from the county assessor's office, all neatly stapled together. Right on top was a photocopy with that familiar raised seal, the one that always cost an extra $5 at the clerk's window. "There's an addendum," Frank said, carefully separating the pages. "Look at this fine print here." My hands weren't quite steady as I took the document. The typeface was small enough to make my eyes water, but there it was, in black and white, a paragraph about conditional conveyance, lifetime rights, quiet enjoyment by the grantor, legal words that suddenly felt like pure gold. "Read it out loud," Frank said. "Sometimes hearing it makes things clearer." I cleared my throat. "The conveyance herein described is subject to and conditional upon the grantor's lifetime right of residence and quiet enjoyment of the property at 1247 Maple Street, said right to be, uninterrupted and inviolable except by voluntary surrender." My voice caught for a moment. By voluntary surrender of the grantor. Frank was already underlining phrases with his finger. "Look here, condition subsequent. And this part about breach reversion. You remember what lawyer drew this up?" The memory hit me like a splash of cold water. It was right after Margaret passed, that sharp-eyed woman attorney, Janet something, who'd insisted we add protection clauses. "Just in case," she'd said, "because sometimes family isn't enough." I'd thought she was being cynical back then. "Hold this steady," I told Frank, pulling out my phone. The camera clicked as I captured every page, every paragraph, every line of that precious fine print. Then I went hunting for the scanner I kept in the office nook, another one of Margaret's habits that had rubbed off on me. "Always have. Backups," she used to say. "Paper can burn, but copies can save you." The scanner hummed to life and I fed each page through carefully, watching the images appear on my laptop screen. Frank stood by, handling me the next sheet each time, like we were performing some kind of legal surgery. In the bottom drawer of my desk was a fireproof envelope, the kind that's supposed to survive anything short of a direct hit from above. The original. Document slid inside with a satisfying rustle. "You know what this means," I said, sealing the envelope with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "If this holds up, if that clause means what I think it means, the house might already be safe," Frank finished, nodding slowly. "Assuming they honor the contract." I looked around the kitchen, at the warm wood cabinets Margaret had picked out, at the window where she'd kept her African, violets at the door frame with pencil marks showing how tall our daughter had grown. All of it still mine, by right of law and love and careful planning. "Thing about contracts," Frank said quietly, gathering up the scattered papers, "is they're only as good as the people willing to enforce them." I patted the fireproof envelope. "Then I guess we'd better make sure these words have teeth." Just as I was about to close the file, Frank's finger shot out. "Hold on. What's this little number down here?" I squinted at the tiny footnote he was pointing to, barely visible at the bottom of the page. The kind of fine print you'd miss if you weren't looking for trouble, and boy, were we looking now. See that asterisk? Frank tapped the paper. It's referring to something. I flipped through the pages, scanning the bottom margins, until I hit the last sheet. There it was, in type so small it might as well have been ant tracks. All residential protections herein described shall lapse on January 1st of the subsequent calendar year unless formally enforced or reaffirmed by the parties. My stomach dropped. You ever have one of those moments where victory turns to ashes in your mouth? That's what it felt like, sitting there in my kitchen with that damned legal deadline staring up at me. What's today's date? I asked, though I already knew. Hard to forget when Christmas dinner's still burning a hole in your gut. December 27th. Frank's voice was grim. He reached for the legal pad and wrote in big block letters, "Ticking clock, Jan 1, then underlined it 3 times. 4 days, I muttered, running my hand over my face. They knew. That's why they picked New Year's for the closing. They must have found this clause and realized it was their chance to lock me out for good. Frank pulled the pad closer. Then we don't waste a minute. Let's make a list. His pen scratched across the yellow paper. 1. Notify lawyer, first thing tomorrow. I nodded, my mind already racing. Add breach letter to that. We need to put them on formal notice. Good thinking, he wrote quickly. And we'll need a sit-down meeting, with witnesses present. Copies, I added. Multiple sets of everything we found tonight. The memory of Margaret's voice floated through my head. Paper trails don't lie, Walter. That's why we keep such careful books. Frank was still writing. We should document any admissions they've made, anything they've said that proves intent. That's when it hit me. I sat up straighter, remembering Christmas night. Frank, I said slowly, when my daughter stood up at dinner, when she shouted that they never wanted me there. Witnesses. Frank's eyebrows went up. The whole family was there, grandkids, cousins, everyone. I could still see their faces, shocked and staring, as my daughter's words echoed off the dining room walls. Frank smiled for the first time that night. That's good. That's very good. Any chance someone recorded it? People are always taking videos at holiday gatherings. I shook my head, but then stopped. Wait a minute. There was music playing through their smart speaker system. Don't those things keep audio histories? They do indeed, Frank wrote. Check speaker logs on the pad. And what about texts? You said they've been sending messages. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the cold dismissals and that cruel, "It's for the best" text. Got them all right here. Save them. Screenshot everything. Frank checked his watch. It's nearly midnight. First thing tomorrow we call Janet Hammond. I blinked. That's her name, the attorney who drew up the original paperwork. How did you remember? Because she's still practicing, and she specializes in elder law. He was already pulling up a number on his phone. Her office opens at 8. We'll be there at 8:01. The kitchen clock ticked away another minute as I stared at our battle plan laid out in Frank's neat handwriting. 4 days to stop a betrayal. 4 days to save my home. 4 days to show my daughter that some things, like dignity and justice, don't have expiration dates. I set my alarm for 7 a.m. and carefully arranged the fireproof envelope with our other evidence. Every piece of paper felt like a bullet in the chamber, ready to defend what was mine. The question was, would we have enough time to fire them all? The morning sleet stung my face as Frank and I hurried into Janet Hammond's law office. 2 days till New Year's? 2 days to stop a theft dressed up as family business? You know that feeling when you're carrying something precious through a storm? That's how those folders felt, tucked safe and dry inside my coat. The office hadn't changed much in 5 years. Same oak paneling, same leather chairs that creaked when you sat down, same smell of coffee and old books. Even the receptionist's desk had that familiar brass nameplate. Martha Wilkins, since 1982. Some things stay steady in this world, thank God for that. I laid out our evidence on Janet's conference table like I was setting up for inventory day at the hardware store. Everything in its place, everything labeled. You learn a thing or two about organization when you've run a business for 40 years. Deed, I said, tapping the first stack. Addendum. Another tap. Witness statements from Christmas dinner. Tap. And recorded. Admissions. Final tap. The pages made a satisfying sound against the polished wood. Frank stood by the window, watching sleet pepper the glass. He'd barely said a word since we'd arrived, but I could feel him listening, ready. Janet Hammond sat across from me, silver reading glasses perched on her nose as she worked through the documents. Her eyebrows went up at the conditional ownership clause. "I remember insisting on this," she said, more to herself than to us. Then she hit the expiration date and those eyebrows climbed even higher. "January 1st, she murmured. "That's 2 days away," I finished for her. Martha's voice came through the intercom just then, professional as ever. "Miss Hammond, Mr. and Mrs. James Connor have arrived." My daughter's married name still felt wrong in my ears. My pulse picked up, but I kept my hands flat on the table. Let the paper do the talking. First, that was the plan. I heard them before I saw them. My daughter's laugh, bright and artificial. Her husband's deeper chuckle. The sound of expensive boots on carpet. Then the door opened, and there they stood, all confidence and winter fashion. "Dad?" My daughter's smile flickered for just a moment. "What are you doing here?" I stayed quiet, watching their faces as they took in the spread of documents. James tried to keep his grin in place, but I saw the moment he recognized the deed's official stamp. His eyes narrowed, darting from stack to stack. "Ms. Hammond," he said, "we weren't expecting a family meeting." "Please sit down," Janet said, her tone courtroom cool. "We have some matters to discuss regarding the property at 1847 Maple Street." They sat. My daughter crossed her legs, adjusted her scarf. James leaned back, trying to look relaxed, but his fingers were tight on the chair's armrests. "I'll begin by reading the relevant sections," Janet said, lifting the deed. "I suggest you listen carefully." The room went quiet, except for the soft patter of sleet against glass. Frank hadn't moved from his spot by the window, but I felt his presence like a guard at my back. "Paragraph 1, Janet began, her voice clear and measured. "This conveyance of title is made subject to and conditional upon the following. Terms and covenants." I watched my daughter's face as the words landed, watched her smile fade completely as Janet reached the residence clause, watched James sit forward, his casual pose crumbling. "The grantor shall retain full right of residence and quiet enjoyment of said property for the duration of his natural life," Janet continued. "Any attempt to terminate or abridge these rights shall constitute a material breach." My daughter's hand went to her throat. James's jaw clenched. They hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to find the clause, hadn't expected me to fight back. They'd counted on my confusion, my grief, my willingness to believe I was the burden they'd named me. But I wasn't confused anymore. Grief, yes, that was a stone in my chest that would never leave. But as Janet read on, laying out in precise legal language exactly what they'd tried to steal, I felt something else too. Something that had been sleeping since Margaret died. It felt like strength. Janet's voice filled that conference room like a judge's, each word another nail in their coffin. "The condition is explicit," she said, tapping the page. "Any attempt to sell or transfer the property without the grantor's consent automatically triggers reversion of full ownership back to Mr. Whitaker. You know that moment when you're fixing something complicated and suddenly all the pieces click into place? That's what it felt like, watching their plan fall apart line by line. "Now wait just a minute," James cut in, leaning forward with that salesman's smile of his. "This is clearly outdated paperwork. We have more recent—" "If I may continue," Janet said, not even looking up. She pulled out the notarized addendum, its official seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "This provision is reinforced by State Statute 47.228, which protects elderly property owners from unauthorized displacement." She slid her glasses down and fixed James with a look that could have frozen coffee. "The statute has no expiration date." I glanced at my daughter. The color was draining from her face like water from a cracked basin. She'd always been fair, like her mother, but now she looked almost ghostly. Her hand kept touching her throat, fingering that expensive scarf she wore. "The timeline is quite clear," Janet continued, laying out 3 more documents. "The deed transfer occurred on March 15, 2020. The condition was recorded the same day. Mr. Whitaker's signature and initials appear on all relevant pages." She paused, letting that sink in. "The attempted sale of the property, dated December 26th of this year, constitutes a direct breach." Frank shifted by the window, and I caught his slight nod. We'd been right about everything, the clause, the timing, all of it. "This is ridiculous," James sputtered. "We have buyers waiting. The closing is set for—" "The closing," Janet interrupted, "is void. As of this moment, full title reverts to Mr. Whitaker." She looked at me. "Would you like to make a statement for the record?" I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 75 years, but standing straight all the same. "Notice will be sent today to the buyers and the title office," I said, keeping my voice steady. "That's all." James's face had gone red. "This changes nothing," he muttered. "We're moving on anyway. You can keep your damn—" I kept that last folder closed on the table, the one with Frank's recordings from Christmas dinner, the one with their cruel words captured in crystal clarity, ready to share with their church, their neighbors, their children's school. But that was for later if needed. Sometimes the best tool in your box is the one you don't have to use. My daughter wouldn't look at me. She was staring at her hands, at the diamond ring that caught the winter light. I wondered if she was calculating losses, the down payment on whatever place they'd planned to buy, the broker's fees they'd now eat, the bridge loan I knew they'd taken out. The room had shifted. You could feel it in the air, like when a storm front moves through and the pressure changes. They'd walked in owning my home, sure they could sell it out from under me. Now they sat there owning nothing but their own shame. Janet gathered the documents with practiced efficiency. "I'll have my office prepare the formal notices," she said, "unless there are any questions." There weren't any. Not really. Just the sound of expensive chairs scraping back as they stood, the whisper of my daughter's coat as she turned away, the sharp click of her boots as she fled toward the door. James lingered for a moment, his jaw working like he had something to say. But what was there to say? The law was the law. The papers were the papers. And I was still my father's son, the man who'd taught me to measure twice, cut once, and always, always keep good records. I watched them go, then sat back down, my legs suddenly shaky. Frank's hand landed on my shoulder, warm and solid. "Well," he said quietly, "that's the house secured." I nodded, thinking of Margaret's rocking chair by the window, of her garden sleeping under the snow, thinking of how the morning light would still find me there in our home when the new year dawned. I waited until their footsteps faded down the hall before reaching for that last folder. You know the kind, manila, crisp, edges, the sort that holds either nothing or everything. In this case, it held truth. "There's one more matter," I said, sliding out 2 items, a printed transcript and a small USB drive. Frank was thoughtful enough to preserve Christmas dinner for posterity. Janet raised an eyebrow, professional curiosity flickering across her features. "Audio recording. Smart speaker in the living room," Frank explained from his spot by the window. Amazing. What those things remember when you check the history. My daughter's hand froze on her purse strap. I could see her mind working, rewinding through that night, through every bitter word she'd thrown across her own dinner table. "We never wanted you here." The words looked so stark on paper, printed in clean black type. Different somehow from when they'd been hurled at me through candlelight and steam. "The legal matter is settled," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "But there's a matter of sincerity that the family deserves to understand. The congregation too. They've been asking questions." James took a half step forward, but Janet's raised hand stopped him cold. "To be clear," she said, "any reputational consequences fall outside the court's purview, but not outside the community's," Frank added softly. "People have been wondering what happened that night. Why Walter suddenly stopped coming to church suppers. Why the grandkids haven't visited." I watched my daughter's face as the implications sank in. Her eyes went wide, darting between the transcript and the USB drive. I could almost see the images flashing through her mind, her children hearing their mother's voice dripping with contempt for their grandfather. The church ladies who'd watched her grow up, who'd brought casseroles when Margaret passed, listening to her casual cruelty. The neighbors who'd smiled and waved for years, learning how she'd tried to sell her father's home out from under him. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "I'm not doing anything," I replied. "Frank will simply provide copies to those who've asked directly. Nothing more, nothing less, just the truth in your own words." James's face had gone from red to white. He knew as well as I did how fast word would spread, how thoroughly their carefully maintained image would crumble. Country club memberships meant little when you were known as the couple who tried to throw an elderly father into the street at Christmas. "The keys," I said quietly. "I'll need them back. Both sets. My daughter fumbled in her purse, hands shaking. The keys clattered onto the table, the brass one I'd given her for emergencies, the spare from the kitchen drawer. They looked small against the polished wood, these little pieces of metal that had meant trust once. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd give the house a few days' peace," I continued. "Time to settle back into itself." Janet was already preparing the formal key transfer document. Always good to have things in writing. That's one lesson this whole affair had certainly driven home. Frank stepped away from the window, his shadow falling across the table. "I'll handle the recordings," he said. "Keep everything proper and documented." I nodded, watching my daughter's shoulders slump. She'd always hated consequences, even as a child. Would cry and rage when her actions caught up with her. But she'd been young then, and I could still gather her up, still explain how to make things right. Now she stood there, perfectly styled hair and designer clothes, looking somehow smaller than she had at the Christmas table. Amazing how truth could do that. Strip away all the fancy trappings and leave just the bare fact of who someone had chosen to be. James touched her elbow, steering her toward the door. He opened his mouth like he might argue, but what defense could there be against his own recorded voice? Against the casual way he'd discussed draining the old man for good. "The notices will go out today," Janet reminded them. "I trust there won't be any issues with access or belongings." They shook their heads, already turning away, already retreating. Their footsteps echoed down the hall again, but different now, slower, heavier, carrying the weight of what they'd lost. Not just a house or an investment, but something far more precious and much harder to replace. I gathered up the deed papers, leaving the transcript and USB drive with Frank. Through the window, I could see snow starting to fall, again soft and steady, the kind that covers everything fresh and clean. The sun was already low when I pulled into the driveway that December 30th. Funny how different a house looks when you know it's truly yours again, every brick and shingle standing a little prouder. I took my time with the front door, letting the key slide home like I was introducing myself to an old friend. You know that feeling when you walk into a space that's been waiting for you. When the walls seem to exhale and the floors creak a welcome, that's how it felt stepping back into my home knowing no one could take it away again. First thing I did was head for Margaret's rocking chair. It had been sitting in the corner of the bedroom since that Christmas night, like it was hiding from all the ugliness. I wrapped my arms around the familiar oak frame, still solid after all these years, just like the woman who'd loved it, and carried it to the front window. The late afternoon light caught the polish I'd given it last spring, making the wood glow warm and deep. I smoothed one of Margaret's quilts across the back, the blue and white one she'd made the winter before she passed, the colors still bright, like they were keeping her touch alive. Drawing the curtains wide, I caught the first snowflakes starting their slow dance down from pewter clouds. Perfect timing. Margaret always said fresh snow had a way of making the world look new again. The mantel seemed the right place for the reversion notice, clean and official on that cream-colored paper, every word a brick in the wall between me and their schemes. Next to it I set down the title confirmation, crisp and final. They made quite a pair there beside our wedding photo, Margaret smiling out from behind glass, young and radiant in her mother's lace. Standing guard, you might say, over the proof that her home stayed safe. Frank's text came just as I was settling into the kitchen. The buyers had backed out clean. Seems they weren't interested in property with complicated family situations. Can't blame them there. Another message followed. The neighborhood association had gotten wind of everything. Mary Chen, who runs their Facebook group, had shared the recording. "Some things need sunlight," she wrote. "We're with you, Walter." I was fixing tea when Janet's headlight swept across the window. She'd promised to drop the final paperwork by, but I guess seeing my daughter's car pull up to the curb hit harder than expected. The engine idled for a long moment, then moved on without stopping. Could have been Janet changed her mind about delivery. Could have been my girl taking one last look at what she'd lost. Either way, I let it pass without comment. Some silences say more than words ever could. You'd think I'd feel bitter watching those taillights fade. But standing there in my kitchen, breathing in the sharp winter air mixing with lemon polish and old wood, I felt something else entirely. Peace, maybe. Or whatever you call it when you choose dignity over anger. The house creaked and settled around me as darkness crept in. Every familiar sound, every shadow in its proper place. I thought about what they'd lost, Not just the sale money they'd counted on, but something far more precious. Their standing in the community, the respect of neighbours, their children's trust, all gone now, swept away by their own recorded words. The snow was falling steadily as I lowered myself into Margaret's rocker. The runners found their rhythm on the hardwood, same as they had 10,000 nights before. I touched the quilt draped across the back, remembering how she'd rock here during storms, telling me every creak and groan was just the house talking to itself. "Well, old girl," I murmured, "what would you make of all this?" The answer came in her voice, clear as if she sat beside me. "Betrayal breaks blood, but dignity rebuilds men." I rocked once, letting the truth of it settle. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything clean and white, while inside, the house held me steady, same as it always had.